Today, as we celebrate this 24th Sunday in Ordinary Time in the midst of a pandemic and the beginning of a school year for so many, a time for parents to try to readjust, we look at this message that Jesus offers to us in this lesson. As Peter comes before Jesus and asks him, "How many times must I forgive my brother? 7 times?" And Jesus comes up with this number. No, not 7 times, but 77 times. I'm not sure about you, but in trying to study and look at the commentaries on this passage, it's interesting to see that Peter was trying to be very generous. The 7 in meaning is that fullness. And yet, Moses, in his seeking to give a way of life, had said, "You must forgive 3 times." So Peter was trying to be quite generous and saying, "Lord, see, I understand." And Jesus turns to him and says, "No, you don't. It's 77 times, the fullness of all that pardon." When we listen to this, we hopefully are able to look at not so much seeking to count 77 times, but rather, how do we recognize and ask God's forgiveness in our lives? As we do so, we look and recognize, hopefully, that at times the choices that we make in our lives can be quite heavy and quite difficult to carry out. There is a small story of a person who came to a monk and was seeking to live a better way of life, and asked the monk, what must he do? The monk turned to him and handed him a canvas sack and told him, "Go out into the field and pick potatoes and carve on each of those potatoes those who have wronged you and you have not forgiven. And along with that, I want you to also put those you have wronged, carving their name, and put those into the potato sack." As the person went and followed what was said, he took and recognized there was only a few. But as the days went on, he would have to go back to the field and find more potatoes and carve the name in them. And at first he didn't think much of it. But as time went on, those potatoes began to rot and to stink. And they started to become quite heavy. And when he returned to the monk to ask him, "This is becoming more than I can bear," he told him, "You need to let go, forgive those who have wronged you, and ask pardon for those you have wronged. And as you do so, you may take the potatoes out of the sack." The person thought for a while and went off and began to seek to offer that forgiveness and to ask forgiveness. And as he did so, he lightened the load. As he came back to the monk with an empty sack, he recognized how often in our daily life that what we carry with us can be a burden. It can be difficult. It can be hard. It weighs us down. And as we seek to accept forgiveness and forgive, we realize that our load is lightened. Ultimately, the person asked the monk, "What do I do with the sack?" And he says, "You need to give that away and give it to somebody else who is seeking to find a better way." in our lives, how often do we look back at those who have wronged us and we still hang on to it? We can remember back to the bully who picked on us, or the person who didn't see us. We live in a world in the midst of a pandemic that has not only the physical, medical difficulties, but we also look at the social ills that have plagued us for so long, and we recognize how we must seek to lighten the burden, that we need in humility to come before the Lord, realizing how we have asked His forgiveness and He has forgiven us, but we in turn also must forgive our brothers and sisters. It's not just in word, it is in action. And as we seek to follow Christ's message, may we realize the abundance of His compassion and His mercy in our lives and seek to share that with one another. How? It is so difficult when we feel wronged, when our emotions and feelings have been hurt, when we have been disrespected, when we have not been seen, when we cannot find ourselves able to breathe and speak, when we are not recognized, when we are hurt. We ask God to help us to take that upper road, to realize that as Jesus offered Himself for us in the forgiveness of sins, He asks us to realize that following Him is not much easier, but that we seek to offer forgiveness and ask forgiveness, to treat one another, not 3 times forgiving, not 7 times, but in that fullness of always seeking in God's grace to recognize as He loves us, so He loves those who have wronged us. As He has forgiven our sins, so He has forgiven those who come before Him and ask that forgiveness. We live in a world that seeks to try to bring about a righteousness and justice. We hope in humility and compassion that we might actively work to recognize one another, to see one another truly as equal and made in the image of God, that all of us may realize that none of us are superior to one another, but rather that we are called to be the servant of each other. When we come before the King, as Jesus uses in the parable, may we be seen to be that compassionate, forgiving steward who made the most of what God has given to us, and recognizing in gratitude that wonder, realize how much we are called to respect and share that with one another and our brothers and sisters. As we go forth this week, may we ask God's care. May we ask His grace. May we seek to lift up one another. May we seek to lighten the burden. May we try to get rid of those potatoes in that sack that smell and rot, that hold us down, that keep us from living that fullness of life. And as we recognize Jesus' death on the cross and His rising, as we celebrate this Eucharist, we give thanks to God for His mercy and love, seeking the grace to offer that mercy and love with each other.